I guess we are live now. Can everyone hear us? Drop some comments in the chat. I think we'll give folks maybe a few minutes to pop in and join. I'm seeing an icon of 30 on the left-hand side, and I think we're expecting quite a bit more than that.
Well, how about we start with this, Jerry? Where are you located?
So I'm typically located in Boston, but I'm actually in Lake Tahoe for this month. How about yourself?
Very nice. I am in Newport Beach, California, so just south of LA, and that's where I'm based, but I was in Chicago all week. We've got about a dozen fulfillment centers out there and just opened up one of our largest facilities out there in Q3. And for everybody in the chat, yeah, if you guys want to throw in where you're dialing in from as well. I see Lindsay in Milwaukee. So yeah, let's see where everybody else is coming in from. Let's see who's coming in from the furthest place too.
Yeah, this is your opportunity to get some shout outs. Ooh, Toronto. Argentina.
We'll do the next one in person down there.
San Fran, some more West Coast. Ooh, across the pond in Germany. Seeing some more Canada, Calgary. So we're still seeing some folks trickling in. Feel free to, as you guys kind of jump in, let us know where you're from. All right, another Boston. Always good to see some folks from Boston. And another from across the pond, out in Poland. Oh, Wilton, Connecticut. I actually grew up in Ridgefield, right next door, so I used to swim against you guys.
Well, I think Poland and Germany are battling for the furthest, at least from us.
Yeah.
So yeah, you want to jump on into everything?
Yeah. I think we've hit just about the 5-minute mark. So why don't we get started? So hey everyone, welcome to the Tariffs Are Looming webinar. We're excited to talk tariffs with y'all, and then we have some great content lined up. So I think first things first, we should start with intros. So my name is Jerry Wu, and I'm the GM of Services at Intelligems. Intelligems is a profit growth platform for e-com brands. We allow you to A/B test anything on your site, from homepage and P2P content to prices, promotional offers, and more. And then I lead our managed services practice, which is an in-house agency to design, run, and analyze A/B tests on behalf of brands who need that additional help. Unfortunately, Eric can't join us today due to a family emergency, but I'm joined by Casey Armstrong from ShipBob. Casey, do you want to quickly introduce yourself as well?
For sure. Casey Armstrong, the CMO over here at ShipBob. So I, as you would guess, oversee the marketing function, but I'm fortunate to oversee partnerships and a few other items as well, which is why I get to work with awesome companies like Intelligems. So just like we asked everybody to call out where they're calling in from, if you guys want to throw out the companies you're from in the chat as well, would love to see that too. So while I finish my intro. So I joined ShipBob in 2018. It's been, a lot of fun to see the growth that we've been able to have, in partnership with our customers. And so we actually shipped more items this Black Friday, Cyber Monday week last year than my entire first year over at ShipBob. So it's pretty cool to see. And we'll dive into how our network's expanded from just a handful of facilities in the United States to 60 plus fulfillment centers around the world, and supporting D2C, marketplace, B2B, everything under the sun. So excited to dive into all of that today.
Awesome. And then in terms of agenda today, I'm gonna kick off first. So I'm gonna do a quick high-level recap of how tariffs will impact you. I think for many of you, it'll probably just be a refresher. And then I'm gonna focus on the pricing side as a lever to help manage your top line and bottom line. And then we'll probably have some time for Q&A in between. And then I'll pass it on to Casey, who will talk through kind of the ops and logistics strategy side of things. And then we'll have some more Q&A, and I think we'll have a good amount of time for Q&A at the end. But as questions come up, feel free to drop them into the chat, and then we have some folks helping out behind the scenes who will help bubble up the Q&A questions to us to help answer. Awesome. So let's get started. So quick refresher on basically the two ways tariffs will impact you as a brand. So typically, on one hand, if you're importing freight directly into the States and then distributing to the end customer domestically, that's going to be typically seen as tariffs will basically be charged on kind of that wholesale cost. So what you'll typically experience is essentially an increase in your cost basis. So if you don't adjust your pricing and you keep pricing the same, there's going to be limited demand impacts on your end customer if you keep prices the same, but that's really going to erode your profit margins and kind of hit your bottom line and your profitability. I think the second way in which tariff impacts would essentially flow through is if you're a company or brand that's shipping directly to the end customer from abroad, then tariffs will typically be charged on the retail price, and those costs will typically be borne by the buyer itself. And so, in terms of how that impacts your brand, if you keep prices the same, the price experienced by your end customer will be different. They're going to be paying more. That's going to lead to demand impacts, where customers are likely to purchase less. You're going to have a conversion and top line headwind, and then that's going to also flow down to reduce profitability. And so today we're going to talk through essentially two ways to help manage that. So one is using pricing as a lever to help mitigate some of those impacts and help protect your bottom line. And then the second piece is how to actually mitigate the impacts of the tariffs themselves through some of the operational and logistics strategies that Casey will probably talk through. So jumping into pricing. Pricing in a post-tariff world. So how do we actually think about pricing and approaching setting prices as tariffs are about to hit in? I think the tariff rules they're going to kick in March, and I think there's a lot that you can do both ahead of time and then after tariffs kick in. So number one, even before tariffs kick in, we think it's really important that brands actually conduct price experiments to understand how customers respond to price changes. So you can actually test prices today and run price experiments to basically understand how your customers respond to price increases. This essentially you'll get a measurement of what is the change in quantity sales to a change in price, and then you can use that measurement from a test today to then model out how the demand response will be for your change in price, and then you can flow through both either today's costs or future potential costs to basically develop scenario plans to figure out what's the best outcome for your business. The second time window that we encourage folks to think about is then price testing about 2 to 3 months after tariffs officially land. Once tariffs land, we expect that the broader e-com industry is going to take some time to make price adjustments. Customers will take some time to adapt to this new equilibrium, new normal. And that's likely going to shift the customer's demand relationship with prices, probably around 2 to 3 months down the road. So we also think that it will be important after tariffs have kicked in and after we've hit a new normal to reevaluate your baseline measurements and reevaluate your prices at that time as well. So, like, how does this actually work? How do we actually use kind of test results to inform optimal price? I'm a charts guy. So left-hand side here just basically shows typically there is this notion of customer elasticity and a price quantity relationship. As you increase price, typically customers are going to purchase less, but the shape of that curve is dependent on how price sensitive your customers are, and that's going to differ from brand to brand. And so when you conduct a price test, a typical price test we suggest running if you've not run one before, is to test both a plus or minus, say 10% increase in your prices. This gets you kind of 2 points on both sides of this kind of demand relationship curve. And then you can use those 2 points as a way to extrapolate out your demand curves. And within a fairly reasonable range around those tested points, your extrapolated curves are not going to be too far off. And as long as you have kind of the demand relationships, a lot of the other inputs to profitability are known. You know what your COGS are, and you have a potential notion of what your future COGS could be under a tariff environment. And you can basically use that to model out what would be the optimal price for you today before tariffs kick in, to pressure test where your prices are right now, as well as what could be a new optimal price and how that would effectively change to maximize your profitability. So the next slide actually gives a little bit more of a visual example of how this works. So, for example, let's say we run a pricing test today. This is pre-tariffs, and we get let's say we test your price. We have a product. Prices are about $100 today. COGS are about $50, and we run a price test to that increases prices by $10. We see that actually demand. We did a 10% increase in price, but we saw a 20% decrease in unit sales. Elasticity is essentially quantity over price, changing quantity over change in price. So we have this representation of elasticity is -2. So we can extrapolate out this elasticity and demand relationship, and then given your current COGS, we can basically calculate, hey, what's the optimal profit maximizing point for your business given these different prices. And in this case, we have an example that shows that actually prices set at $100 today is the optimal point. We can actually use these measurements, these same demand relationships, but you can flow through what your expected new COGS will be in a new tariff environment to basically then pressure test, hey, what would be the new optimal price in a post-tariff world? So a few callouts, if you'll notice between this and the last slide, is that your in all situations, estimated profit goes down because as tariffs kick in, you're going to be experiencing an increase in your effective COGS. But when you raise prices to protect your margins, you're going to also be trading off some customer demand relative to your clawback of some profit margin. So in this particular example, we're actually even though COGS has increased by $12.50, right? That's roughly 25%. We think that it's only optimal from the model to basically increase price by $5, and that's primarily because customers in this particular example are more price sensitive. So for every brand, this is going to differ, but I think the methodology and approach that you can take it should apply to most brands here. And the last example is to what I alluded to, that kind of 2 to 3 months down the road, what would happen if you tested and experimented again? Well, it's important to remeasure that customer relationship. In this particular example, I flowed through this assumption in this scenario where effectively customers have gotten used to the price increase. As competitors in the landscape has increased prices, customers may be far less price sensitive to a price increase than what you had measured before. And then this gets to a point where possibly 2 to 3 months down the road, you have more of an opportunity to raise prices with less of a demand impact on your customers. So that's essentially kind of our thinking in our on how to apply price tests and price measurements to kind of develop these scenarios and how to find essentially what would be the right price for your brand. And then one last kind of bonus tip is beyond actual figuring out what your prices are and the right price levels, how you actually display price increases will also matter. And the approach that you take will potentially change how customers respond to price. So there's this question of, do you flow price increases directly to your retail price? Or do you actually break that out and show that to your customer differently? And so this is also a plug for us on the Intelligems side, where we're actually launching an app to help you as a brand change how you display tariffs, and this will allow you to essentially break out the cost of your tariffs in how break out the tariff component of price to display that and provide more transparency to your customer. And this is something that every brand should also think about testing in terms of how you message those price increases in both your kind of promotional marketing materials and how you also display that on your site. And that's another very important lever to kind of consider. Awesome. Yeah. So I guess in Q&A, so basically what I'm trying to say is that it's important to kind of test prices today, use those measurements to kind of scenario plan to figure out, hey, what's the optimal price, not just today, but once tariffs have actually kicked in for yourself. And then 2 to 3 months down the road, reassessing that and remeasuring to make sure that you've got it right, in particular as the landscape and environment changes. Cool. Feel free to continue to drop questions in the chat.
Jerry, I have a question before we throw it to me. If you want to go back to the example of the product you guys are rolling out, if you could just talk through that one a bit more. I see there's the tag in the checkout under the mug with the 1x 25% tariff. Yeah, if you could just expand a little bit more, like what are you guys pulling off in this new solution, and do you guys have it live with any customers right now?
Yeah, so this is currently in development. We're going to have this live soon, and essentially this will allow brands to basically apply tariffs to specific customers based off of the various tariff rules, and then also help change how those tariffs are displayed both in cart and checkout. And so this way we can basically allow brands to be more transparent with customers on how tariffs are being shown within your on your website.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I think we have a blog post from our devs as well on our website, and we'll be sure to, we'll be happy to also kind of share that separately once potentially post this webinar as well. Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of this question on what do you do with relatively low traffic. So when we think about our testing approach, I think in order to understand the impact, you're going to need to have some level of measurement. But for some brands, you with high traffic, you might be able to test to a higher level of granularity. But for brands with relatively low traffic, you can test at a site-wide level as opposed to a product or site-wide or even a large segment level. So say, hey, let's move 10% of this prices on the site by 10% as a whole, and then use that to basically extrapolate out for your customers' price sensitivity across your website in aggregate, as opposed to on individual product items. The other piece that you can kind of tweak, there's this kind of notion of statistical in terms of significance. You can also tweak how long you run those measurements for. So for some brands with large amounts of traffic, you can potentially get results in 1 to 2 weeks. But for brands with lower traffic, it might mean running a test for longer than 2 weeks into the kind of 1 month territory to kind of get a good sense and a good read. So increasing the aperture both in terms of time and in terms of the product set.
Curious, how often do you see people testing like free shipping and charging for shipping?
So that's actually something that we see folks test quite commonly. So free shipping typically is something that if you offer free shipping, obviously you're betting on there being a conversion benefit to that. But if you actually have, the other thing that we test is the right free shipping threshold, because as you increase those thresholds, you may also be inducing customers to expand their order size. But not all customers will necessarily be responsive to that. So we see brands testing that both today, but also understanding, hey, how does that shift in the future as well? Because your customer base changes as well as the behavior of your customer base. So that's something that we see brands test quite often. Awesome. I'm not seeing one more. In terms of display, have you seen brands testing allocating cost increases a price increase versus a shipping rate increase? So I think this can be done both ways. So brands have done both, and so if you think about your your different levers on site, you can either increase prices on an individual product. You can also test different ship rates on site. And sometimes you'll find that people are more responsive or more price sensitive to changes in ship rate versus changes to retail price. And so one thing that is also worth testing is basically, hey, how do people respond to dollar increases in retail price versus dollar increases to ship rate, and which of those levers are people less price sensitive to, and then you can basically use ship rate increases potentially as a more as a lever instead of price if customers are less price sensitive to it. That's going to differ from brand to brand. I think it's an important factor to measure as well. Awesome. Casey, I'm going to now kick it off to you to kind of talk more on the operations and logistics side.
Perfect. Sounds good.
And then for those of you who are still dropping in questions, we'll also have time at the end to also to do QA, and we can kind of loop back on any of these pricing questions as well.
Great. If you want to go, so actually, if you want to go back a slide real quick. So really starting in December, I guess actually in Q3, Q4 of last year, the US government started hinting at some likely changes that were going to happen around the tariffs and duties and taxes. And it was really got kicked off in the middle of December with some changes that happened from the government in Mexico. then that really, I'd say, hit the ground running full speed in the middle of January under the Biden administration. They made some pretty large proposals around, especially impacting China and the duties and taxes and de minimis changes there, which I'm going to get into shortly. And then that was followed on shortly after by the Trump administration as well. And so I think what's been pretty interesting, at least from the US standpoint, is it's seemed like a rather bipartisan stance. And so that's where a lot of this stuff has, I'm sure a lot of you have felt this, where it's kind of started and stopped over the last few weeks and the last few months in particular. But it does seem like some changes will be cemented rather shortly, because I know a lot of suggestions have come into place, but then the U.S. infrastructure is not in place to enforce some of these rules. But we'll get into that shortly. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. So ShipBob, I'll be very quick with this. So as I mentioned earlier, we're a global fulfillment solution. We have fulfillment centers across US, Canada, UK, EU, Australia. We can really support regardless of where or how you sell. Again, whether that's direct to consumer, marketplace, like an Amazon, social channels like a TikTok, or through retail and wholesale partnerships as well. And we're fortunate to work with some amazing brands, some of who you can see on this slide as well, and some who I know also work with Intelligems. And for us, of course, there is the fulfillment infrastructure around the world, in the US in particular. And of course, we need to have best-in-class supply chain and performance SLAs, but it's really the technology that drives a lot of this. And so on one side, it's the merchant application, which our customers log into every day to really run their supply chain. And at the bottom of the technology stack, it's our warehouse management system, or WMS. That's what powers everything in our fulfillment centers around the world. So everything is apples to apples, whether it's our flagship facility about an hour east of where I am, or our latest global facility out in the Netherlands. So let's dive into really kind of the before and after. I'm generalizing quite a bit because I don't know how into the weeds we all want to get with taxes and duties and tariffs, especially since we're now in this, I'd say, afterworld. But again, generally speaking here, before February, brands were allowed to take advantage of often what was Section 321 and sometimes other sections, this de minimis exception. And so they were allowed to ship what was considered low value shipments, which was increased from $200 to $800 per individual order, into the United States, either from China or from multiple countries into Canada and or Mexico, and then into the US to serve the US customers. And they were able to bypass some of the, they were able to have it enter the US duty free. And so just like Jerry talked through of what the impact was on margins and essentially what your total COGS would be, again, this was a huge, really loophole that was maybe not intended for this specifically for these direct to consumer brands, but a lot of brands were taking advantage of this in Canada and Mexico, or direct from China, whether they were early on in their journey, or some massive companies like Temu and Shein. They were able to take advantage of that at a massive scale by shipping directly from China. And then what was interesting too is Amazon wanted to take advantage of this opportunity as well. And so they launched the Amazon direct to consumer. With these changes lately, it'll be interesting to see if they completely shutter that program. And so the changes after, and would love to hear anybody in the chat that wants to throw in of what they've felt firsthand and how they've navigated this. I know that there's a handful of ways that you can go about it, especially since there still is some uncertainty. But again, we're kind of lumping a handful of changes into one here for simplicity's sake, and happy to dive into the weeds again. So in China, the tariffs were set at 10% on all imports, and the de minimis exemptions were eliminated. And so the US has walked back on this to an extent just by saying, hey, we don't necessarily have all the infrastructure in place, because what would happen with the de minimis exceptions removed is the way that things were recorded as they came into the United States and the way that the de minimis taxes were collected. Obviously, there's a lot that has to go into that. but they've signaled that is going to come. And so a lot of brands are coming into, yes, there's no one to collect the duty. That will come. And so we've seen some very large brands coming to us really when Mexico and the MX changes started to come into place to get ahead of this stuff. And that onslaught of brands looking to bring everything stateside has not slowed down. And we'll talk about how brands are navigating this from a cost-effective standpoint. And then in Canada and Mexico, yes, the tariff set to 25% on most imports. And so oftentimes you need to look at the HS codes to see the actual impact from a tariffs perspective. And then right now there are no exclusions except for energy products from Canada. And again, the de minimis exemptions have been eliminated for imports into the US. With some of the tariffs for Canada and Mexico, those items have been postponed. But again, the US was very clear that this is getting postponed. And also in April, the team is working at a much more holistic level on what are some more of the global changes that are going to happen with duties and taxes, and what does that look like across the United States. And so what does this mean for your brand? So again, Jerry's talked about some of this already, but increased duties really impacting these low value shipments, which is not really low value. Again, it used to be $200 and then it was increased to $800. And again, these are higher costs for these businesses engaged in the cross-border e-commerce. And I think what's interesting to note, and what we've heard from partners of ours like Shein and Temu, is it does impact them. But unlike some of the changes that happened with TikTok, where the rules were going directly at TikTok, these aren't going directly at Temu. These are not going directly at Shein. These are countrywide. And so everybody's really playing on the same playing field. And so everybody has to navigate these in a very similar fashion, albeit at different scale. And then, of course, potential disruptions in supply chain. That is definitely top of mind. I have so much empathy for all of you trying to navigate this, especially if you were utilizing shipping direct from China or shipping into Mexico and Canada. We are now working with one brand. They had about 5 million units on the water getting ready to be landed in Mexico, and had to, they came to us pretty quickly to try to find a way to divert that and find a way for both the near term and, or I should say the immediate term and the long term. How could they find a partner that could help support them across all of their channels, and especially with the massive volume that they have and their requirements from a technology perspective. And then, of course, the price hikes for consumers. And so this is where solutions like Intelligems are great to really analyze, well, how much should I actually be pricing to get the most optimal margins on my sales? And so, of course, there's a lot that goes into that. Consumers have been getting squeezed from an inflation perspective for a while. And so I know brands are very cognizant of how much can they increase or decrease that as well. And then real quick, before we get to the next slide, I saw from Team Cosmic a question, 10% of the value of the goods or of, it says W, I don't know what the W is, but depending on when those come in, if you are importing into the US and then shipping from the US to the US customers, it will be 10% of the manufacturing value, not the consumer price. So let's say it costs, to use Jerry's example, I believe these numbers are right. Let's say it costs $50 to manufacture and $100 to sell. It will be the 10% of the $50, not the 100. Great. If you want to go to the next slide. And so really, how should brands be navigating this, especially if they are worried that these changes will be fully cemented and here for the long term? Which I see some questions on that in the chat, and I'll get to that shortly. But I believe that they will be coming and will be here for the long term. Again, both parties were pushing this pretty aggressively, and so I'd be pretty surprised to see people backtrack from that. And so a couple ways is just really rethinking, at least in the short term. If you are able to bring in a surplus of inventory, that's an easy thing for us to say. It's a much harder thing for companies to do because you have to manufacture these goods, and also there's the capital allocation. We did actually launch ShipBob Capital, if that's of help for anybody. But again, I know that comes with the pros and cons. But I know there have been a lot of supply chain shocks and these delays or even restrictions on the imports. And so, that is one thing that we've seen some of the brands doing to get ahead of stuff. And also, I don't know when Chinese New Year's is this year, but I know that's something that a lot of brands take into consideration as well as they navigate making sure that they've got ample inventory on hand while I know Chinese New Year's essentially like a pause on a lot of the manufacturing. The biggest item, though, I think is placing, strategic placement of the inventory close to the end consumer. And I'll dive even deeper into that in the next slide. And then really streamline global operations. I might be biased here, but really, how can you have everything under one roof to, have this agile and flexible supply chain? So you not only have better visibility and better performance, but you're able to manage everything across D2C, marketplace, retail, depending on how the fluctuation of demand flows across those different channels from one pool of inventory. And so that's where we've seen a lot of brands get a lot of benefit because they can have everything under one roof. And maybe D2C is their primary business, and then they start doing really well on TikTok. Because of this, they start getting more demand on Amazon. They start getting more demand or inquiries from retail partners, and maybe those products stop going viral on TikTok. Instead of having to move the inventory physically from one facility to another, they still have that same pool of inventory that they can utilize for their retail sales, or they can utilize for their direct-to-consumer sales, or they can utilize for their Amazon sales because they've been able to spend more time focusing on that. Or maybe TikTok provided this halo lift that started pulling up more demand on the Amazon side as well. So definitely a huge focus as well. And then if you want to go to the next slide, please. Really distributing your goods, I think, is one of the biggest call outs and how that really helps. And I'll dive into some of the numbers shortly. But with brands that are especially scrambling for what to do because you were utilizing some of the de minimis exceptions in Tijuana or other parts of Mexico, or maybe in Toronto or Vancouver or different parts of Canada, is how can you get inventory quickly and inexpensively into the United States while paying as little as possible for freight. And so this is an example from a customer of ours that brought stuff over. Actually, if you want to go to the slide above. So this is on the picture on the left is how they were shipping everything prior. And so that's from one facility. Everything in the green is what we call short zone shipments. Those are zones 1 to 3. Everything in the yellow is mid zone. And so that's really zones 4 and 6. And then everything red is long zone. So that's everything zones 8 or 7 plus. And if you want to go to the next slide. And so the zones are essentially, when you're pricing fulfillment, and I'm sure a lot of you know this, there's essentially 2 axes. So on one axis is the weights or the dimensional weights, and that's how you can figure out what you're going to pay. And that's also based off of zones. And so the zones is essentially how far a package is traveling, and that impacts your costs, but it also impacts the transit time. And so I know all of us are in the game of how can I ship things as fast as possible and as cheaply as possible. And so that's where distributing the inventory is beneficial, because you want to do it via ground. Anybody can get 2-day shipping via air from one facility, but it's going to be extremely expensive and it's going to crush your margins. Whereas if you can distribute your inventory properly, and you can get those ground shipments, that's where the big wins come from. And so a lot of people go, okay, that's much easier said than done. Well, how do I do this? And so again, we've rolled out our inventory placement program to help people, not just with freight of getting things into or across the United States, but it's also distributing the inventory on your behalf based off of our inventory placement and demand planning tools, to do that extremely cost effectively. So you can get a distribution that looks maybe more similar to this, where you can get a lot of that green and yellow. So how can I get as much short zone shipments as possible? And so with a customer of ours, we were able to save them almost 30% in savings per order by distributing the inventory and really, really reducing those long zone shipments. And not only did they have this massive cost savings, which they could either push back into manufacturing goods or marketing and sales, or they could just take it directly to the bottom line, but also they saw a massive improvement in the transit time. And so because of that, or that was one of the many reasons, well, they were able to 4x increase their order volume in just 6 months, because again, now you're driving this much better customer experience. You're essentially getting this Amazon level experience from your .com website, which often has higher margins than Amazon as well. And that's also with zero additional headcount. And so I know a lot of people say, well, then I just need to hire an army of people to do this. Well, that's why utilizing solutions like that, you can hand things off to another provider and you don't need to increase your headcount, because obviously that impacts your bottom line as well. So those are some of the items to talk to there. And then I see quite a few questions in the chat. So from Petra, I see, what's the likelihood of this being negotiation tool and only temporary increase in tariffs? So as I think obviously I don't work for the government, and so I'm speculating here. I think as we saw with Mexico and Canada, the tariffs were put extremely high, and then they were pretty quickly put on pause. And so while the China tariffs are still in place, and so is it a negotiation tool? 100%. And so again, something we'll keep a very close eye on if they will be put back into place. I think one of the things that the government's taken a pretty hard stance on recently is, if you look at how the same types of goods are tariffed, if we ship things into those countries, US companies are actually tariffed at extremely high clips. And so I would not be surprised to see there be some level of tariffs from a percentage basis. I, of course, am not sure where they will fall. Then Jessica calls out, still a PETA for a while, so a pain in the ass, 100%. Then another question from Petra. So will the tariffs be applied to source materials? It depends on what you import. And so from my understanding, it's tariffed on what is imported when there is actual changes done to the good. So if you import a bunch of source materials, then maybe you'll be tariffed on that. But if you are importing the ready-made manufactured goods and then that is what you're selling, then again, from my understanding, that's what the tariffs will be based off of. Great. Well, if anybody else has any questions on this, please let me know. You can also reach out to us directly at ShipBob as well with any questions.
And the question for the chat, what are you guys worried about that we might not have covered here? And then in any insights that you guys want to share from your end as well. We'd love to hear from you guys.
Well, there's a question there from Sienna, which is really what point, the brand maturity or scale do these price tests become useful? I think what's interesting, and I know this was directed towards you, but I'll chime in real quick, because I've been in, both worlds as I've run direct to consumer brands myself, where, hey, we're just getting started, or hey, we're at a large scale. It's great when you're at a large scale because you can run tests very quickly and continue to move throughout the funnel. I think it's, and Jerry, I would love your take on this. I don't know if there's a time where it's more valuable, of course, when you have a larger scale, because again, you can get those results. But I don't know if there's ever a time where it's too early, because there are so many factors of even measuring that $5 to $10 difference, or whatever the absolute value or percentage might be, based off of your average order value or price point, or how you can bundle things. And then also, free shipping is such a massive lever that these brands have, because Amazon's essentially trained all of us as consumers to really want that. And so, whether you offer free shipping at large or you offer it at certain price cutoffs, being able to have, some solution that can help give you those insights of what that impact looks like over time, I think is extremely helpful. And so even if instead of it just taking a couple days or a couple weeks, like it might for larger scale brands, if it takes you a few months, you can at least have the data mechanisms in place to get those answers to then utilize for your brand moving forward.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you there. I say price testing is really important as long as you have data, and I think the minimum amount of data that we kind of say is required to get a sort of directional read to kind of inform is even just starting with like 100-ish orders per test group, right? Now, obviously, if you're running if you're really, really small or you're launching a new product and you don't have that much traction, at that point, I think we would say, if you think about your prices, that your prices should probably be more informed by in a more qualitative fashion. So I'd say, like, in terms of brand or product maturity, if it's like a brand new product and you don't have and you have very little data at all, then you're going to have to base on some more business rules. So from the products that you already know and from your existing customer response, you should using margins from comparative products, probably the optimal margins from comparative products probably makes sense. And then the other piece is understanding, hey, where are you positioned relative to your competitors, and that generally gives also a price range where if data is enormously thin, in those cases, I would say you would have to kind of resort back to more of business intuition and business rules. I've seen some more questions popping in here now.
So Petra, on the source materials for sellable or for source materials or ready sellable goods. So I'll throw a couple links into the chat. Again, the tariffs can apply to both. It really depends on the HTS codes for the assigned products. And so I will try to share a few links for you there. And then how can you optimize HS codes? Again, that's a good question. I mean, they try to make it as black and white as possible, but of course, with everything, there's some gray area. So I don't have a good answer on that. And then for Juliana, are we seeing brands moving product production from Canada to US to avoid tariffs? At large, no. I mean, moving production is like the change management involved there. Moving fulfillment is tough enough. Moving production is often a whole nother case. Depending on what you are manufacturing, there's obviously the costs that are involved, but there's the quality, there's the minimum order quantity, there's the lead time. There's so many factors that go into the manufacturing side. And so right now we see so many brands manufacturing over in China specifically or across Asia. And so they're evaluating how they want to go about that. With some of the MX changes that Mexico imposed, it wasn't just China that was impacted. That was mostly for apparel brands, but it was anybody who did not have a free trade agreement with Mexico. And so other countries like Vietnam and India that are large manufacturing hubs were also impacted as well. So again, I'm not seeing a bunch of brands move production necessarily from Canada to the US, but that is something, you need to weigh the pros and cons and costs of, does it cost more or less to manufacture in the US versus Canada? Also from like a freight standpoint. And again, there's just so many factors that go into the manufacturing decisions.
Would you say that the impact of changing fulfillment is potentially bigger? Because I'm just thinking through how tariffs get applied. So if tariffs being applied on freight is essentially at your kind of wholesale cost level. But if you're, let's say you're shipping cross border to an end customer, right? So if you're drop shipping, that's typically, those tariffs will often get applied, at least in the U.S., on the retail price, right? So if your margins are high on certain products, would you say that like that impact is higher, like in terms of optimizing fulfillment versus versus where you produce?
Yeah. Again, there's so many factors go into it, including like the customer experience of how long things take to ship and actually get to the consumer's goods. Obviously, you want to typically optimize for, how can you be tariffed on like the least expensive part of the good. But again, from, the reason why a lot of brands were fulfilling out of Mexico is because they were able to bypass a lot of that, but also from a labor perspective, there was savings there as well. And they were willing to take maybe some of the customer experience hit, because let's just say everything went from, the west coast of Mexico, like the Tijuana area, up into San Diego, and then everything would ship from San Diego. If you're shipping in the Northeast, where there's obviously a huge concentration of the U.S. population, that might take 5 to 7 days. And so again, you're taking a hit there. So there's just kind of a balance across, each part of the customer journey and the costs. And like you talked about in one of your examples of, as you're able to build up more demand from the customers, does the price elasticity curve bend a little bit differently where you can charge more? Or if you're providing this longer delivery experience, does the elasticity curve maybe always hold firm and you can't start to increase more? So again, obviously a lot of variables go into play.
Yeah, and a lot of knock-on benefits too, right? So as you one of the things is if you're as you change fulfillment time, there could be an impact in terms of do customers come back after that experience, right? So one thing that's important to measure, and this comes back to the testing point, is not just, hey, what was the immediate impact, but one thing that we encourage brands to also look at is, okay, well, how did those customers behave post their order experience as well? So if you've done something to change the order experience for customers, how has that changed their relationship with your brand and their propensity to come back and shop again and again? And that's something to keep in mind.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having us over at ShipBob here. Both to you, Jerry, and the Intelligems team, but also for everybody in the chat. So really appreciate it. I know we put Heidi's email in the chat. Mine is just my first letter of my first name and then last name. So carmstrong@shipbob.com if you have any questions for me as well. So happy to connect directly with any of you. And I see Jerry's email in the chat as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I also wanted to plus one to that and say, hey, thank you guys all for joining and for the active participation in questions inside the chat. So it was great to chat with you guys all today, and thanks for joining. And feel free to reach back out to us if you have any other questions.
Thanks, Jerry. Thanks, everybody.